So I'm going to do something a little different today. I'm going to take a page from the gathering, actually, borrow what Lance's board here, because I decided I've got so many things to say in 10 minutes. I better write them up on a board. Let's see. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson says, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to or encouraging to live by some other narrative is perhaps the greatest thing you can do. To be yourself in spite of the narratives around us." This idea of living authentically versus living inauthentically, the idea of whether or not we are Muppets or people, so to speak. This is really a question I think we all deal with on a regular basis. I think we find ourselves, wherever we are in our stage of life, we find ourselves with this question of what's the purpose? What am I supposed to be doing? Who am I in the context of this problem? Why is this problem happening to me? Yesterday, I was working out in the yard, and I kid you not, a Bentley drove by, a convertible Bentley. My neighborhood is not one to have a lot of Bentleys in it, but a convertible Bentley came slowly cruising down the residential street with a guy driving it, convertible top down, and blaring out of the speakers were, "I can't get no satisfaction." And I'm thinking, what a great irony. But for all I know, maybe it was that he finally did get satisfaction, so he's singing the song to remind him how he finally got everything he could possibly want. But still, the irony of that seemed to be sort of poignant for our thoughts today as we think about this temptation to be. So I want to suggest a couple of things that we do to sort of set the backdrop for what I think this story invites us to consider, this story of the temptation. Now, we see this story all the time, and we see this as a sort of a story of the great, the temptation of a great being, a supernatural being, Jesus as an other being who's come into earth now to be tested. And it removes, unfortunately, to see it that way, it removes the power of what this story actually can say for us as well. Which is that challenge that I think we talk about in here sometimes when we talk about trying to see things less dualistically and more non-dualistically. The idea of God being the very ground of our being. How do we respond to life if, in fact, as Paul the Apostle said to the Romans, this is the one in whom we live and move and have all of our being. How does that resonate then with this idea of temptation? And what I think we do, and this is something that a guy named Arthur Frank, and I'll just put his name up here. I'm sorry if you can't see this very well, or certainly not read my printing because my handwriting is terrible. Arthur Frank had this idea he called narrative styles. Arthur Frank was diagnosed with cancer, and he went into the hospital, and he was in the hospital for 2 or 3 different visits over a period of a year or so. And he's a journalist, and on one of his longest stays there, he started noticing something with medicine and with people, is that people live by certain ways of thinking. They live by certain narrative styles. And I think this helps us to understand a lot of things. He said, first of all, the most typical narrative style, I'll put this, the most typical narrative style is what he calls restitution. And that simply means that things get fixed. That things are supposed to go a certain way. When they don't, you just go get them fixed. Now, we can immediately resonate with this narrative. We can immediately resonate with how a lot of us experience religion in this narrative. We look to some source to fix it. The only challenge, of course, that he noticed as he was living in the hospital and dealing with this illness was the number of folks whose lives didn't get fixed. And the irony that I hear from some of my nurse friends as well as some of my professor and nursing friends will tell me is that at certain points in hospital care, when things aren't able to be fixed, doctors and nurses sort of disappear because they're trained to fix. But sometimes things can't be fixed. And so we live with this sort of mystery. And then we find ourselves in this next narrative style, or perhaps we find ourselves in this next narrative style all the time, the narrative style of chaos, which is basically life is in disarray, life is upside down. You can tell 2 things. You can see, first of all, there's temporary and there's permanent chaos. All right, temporary chaos is looking for some kind of a solution or some kind of way of living in the mystery. Permanent chaos lives in the chaos. We know people like this. People like this are the folks who often, they're reciting the same stories. I think I shared an example last week of a friend of mine who is always telling me these family narratives, these conflicts in the family and with his friends and this sort of thing. And I've heard these stories from him for years. And so he tells me, he says, I don't know why these things keep happening to me. They just keep happening to me. And I said, because you like them. Which, of course, he was like, what are you talking about? And I said, this has been going on for 15 years. Obviously, you like these stories, even if they're somehow negative or painful. Sometimes we find ourselves living in chaos permanently because the unfamiliarity or the pain is more familiar than going somewhere, as our book In the Dark Wood would suggest, going into the dark wood and trying to live with the simple question of the pain. And leaning into that a little more to ask ourselves, what might we actually be experiencing here? What might we not be telling ourselves here? So, Restitution Chaos, the book that we're reading, takes this third narrative style of quest or journey, which is what I want to think about some this morning with you, is this idea that, in fact, every moment, every experience invites us into a new path, into a new way of seeing things. Impermanence, for example, is a fact of life, is it not? Now, advertising will tell you otherwise. It will do everything in its power to convince you you can stave off impermanence. You can fight the wrinkles. You can buy a new car that looks better than the last one. You can have the perfect family. Advertising is geared around this basic narrative. It's geared around chaos and fixing it, chaos and fixing it, chaos and fixing it. But the Bible is really more about quest and journey. Now, sadly, a lot of folks in the church have made a living off of seeing the church as here, restitution and chaos. That God's really all about fixing things. But that's what our story today is telling us, not so much so. Because you see, when the adversary comes up, which I love this word, if you go into the Old Testament, the New Testament, and you look at the Greek behind the words the devil, you see this word of adversary, challenger. You don't see sort of like evil, you don't see Satan, the angel of God that rebelled against God. You see adversary, which I love as an image because, in fact, we set up our own adversaries, don't we? We oftentimes entrap ourselves with these narratives that are like adversaries that challenge everything we do and tell us there ought to be a way to get it fixed. Well, the church, and I'm not saying the church, I think one of the great joys and blessings of First United Methodist Church, among other churches like this, is this willingness to wrestle with questions. This willingness to live within the realm of questions, to live in the midst of God being the very ground of our being, as opposed to seeking an answer. Now, maybe some of you came from churches where when you sort of broke from the norm, when you broke from sort of the rules that keep these things in order, they didn't know how to deal with it. Some of us have those stories in our background where it could have been any number of things that suddenly our own community began to question our value in the context of that community. And we found ourselves isolated perhaps, or perhaps we found ourselves asking questions that were inappropriate to ask. Those kinds of things are difficult to deal with when you're living out of this restitutional model, this idea that everything's supposed to be perfect. And if not, then we attribute it to God because we don't know God's time and place and we don't know God's plans. But to me, what that says is then you don't really trust in the very ground of your being. That we don't really trust in the one in whom we live and move. The quest narrative, this way of sort of entering into the question, of living in the midst of questions, of seeing life as a story, but not simply as a myth, but as a story we live out, so that every character who we come across becomes a part of that story. If you read a good story, you realize a good story doesn't exist on everything being in perfect order, right? You're bored. You're like, where's the real problems? Where's the conflict? Life is filled with conflict. And as a good writer would say, that's what makes it interesting. Now, when you're living it out as the main character in that story, you may feel the temptation to fall back here to restitution and go, yeah, but I'd rather just get it fixed. I'd rather have everything fixed really quick so that I can get back to stability. But life isn't stability. Life is impermanence. Just go walk through the woods. It's a part of life. There's a wonderful word in Hawaii, which you guys recognize. I don't know if you know that it means this, but it's called aloha, right? And aloha means hello and goodbye. It's this wonderful idea of things are impermanent. They're greetings and they're partings, and greetings and partings. It's the way of life that we see come and go and come and go. And we're all a part of that. Then the story of the temptation, the adversary comes in and says, okay, you've started your journey, you've got your problems here, so let's fix it. All you got to do is turn the stone to bread. Right? Just get to the end of the story. Just fix the problem. And Jesus says, nah, it's not what this is about. And then the adversary says, well then, I'll tell you what, why don't you climb to the top of the hill and throw yourself down and call, or it takes them to the top of a pinnacle, and throw yourself down, and then all the angels and all the other supernatural powers that you have will come and they will save you. Let's get to the end of the story and just fix it. And then finally, the adversary says, I'll tell you what, you're like God. Why don't you simply go to the top here of this mountain, look all around you, and everything you see is yours. You're king, you rule, it's over, everything's the way it should be. And Jesus says, you can't tempt God. Or as I would like to say, in the 21st century, you can't tempt the very ground of our being. You can't change it. You can only live in the midst of it. Then the question is, how do you live authentically in the midst of this impermanence, in the midst of life being filled with suffering and evil and pain and anger and hatred? I love the line from the song that we saw this morning. If you were reading the line from Christine Cain's song, where it says, so you see the person who's basically living their life like the guy in the Bentley. Okay, I'm going to be very stereotypical here for just a moment. And who's driving down and not in touch with his own narrative and is wondering why he can't get enough satisfaction and leaves the trash along the side of the road. And the song says, now what do? How do you respond in the midst of that? Do you live out of anger and righteous indignation? Do you live out of judgment? How do we respond to that? Or do you live out of a sense of authentic compassion and presence in the moment? That's the challenge, I think, that we're faced with all the time. This song that we saw, the clip from Man or Muppet, I loved the fact that at one point, Walter, the puppet, some of you who saw the movie realize that Walter and Gary, the guy, they lived together. They were like brothers of a sort of adopted brothers. And so Gary's problem, of course, is trying to recognize that he's loved by another human, by Amy Adams, who he can't seem to connect with that. He's not picking up on that. And so he's trying to be responsive to the cry or the need of the Muppets, and particularly Walter, who's trying to figure out his purpose in life. He doesn't seem to have all the talents that the other Muppets have. But there's that wonderful scene where he's singing, Am I a Muppet or Am I a Man? And he's completely surrounded by mirrors, right? And of course, throughout the song, there are all these scenes where they're looking at themselves in reflection. And what is it that they see? Think how many times you look in a mirror, and what's the immediate narrative you tell yourself? What's the immediate story you tell yourself? I need to fix it up a little bit. I don't like what I see. I wish I could be this or that. Or do you say, wow, I'm aging with such perfection. The world can't wait to see what they're going to see when I walk out the door. I can't wait to show them. I mean, what is the narrative we tell ourselves? We live by such inauthentic stories, right and left, every moment, and it's such a challenge to get past the impermanence and the sense that things are changing, and the sense that we are part of that, and to live in that moment. Now, in Zen, which I love Zen for a lot of different things, but one of the things that I like about Zen Buddhism is in its practice, its pragmatic sense, is this thing they call being aware of things at a kitchen sink level. And for a while, I didn't understand that. I mean, I've been thinking and reading about Zen for years and years and years. But this idea of living at the kitchen sink level, of perceiving things at the kitchen sink level, is the basic day-to-day mundaneness is where you experience the magic. That moment to moment is an opportunity to delve into the divine, to be present to the ground of being. How hard it is to be present to the ground of being when we're living by these other narratives. How hard it is to be present to each moment, to where God is in each moment, when we're living by these other things that we think should define who we are. So what I want to suggest to you, very quickly, you'll notice I didn't even follow my notes. And now I don't know where they are, so it doesn't matter. Is to ask ourselves these questions. When we experience impermanence, yeah, there we go. Is it an E or an A at the end? Impermanence, impermanence. Nance? I heard nance, okay. Impermanence. When we experience impermanence, the challenge, of course, is to fall back up to here, to fix that impermanence, whatever that is in our lives, whether it's illness, whether it's we don't trust ourselves, whether it's we're not sure we like our partner, whether it's we're not sure we like our job. The challenge is whatever we think about needs to change, is that we want to get it fixed. But the real challenge instead is to be present to that moment, to recognize impermanence is a way of life, to recognize when we're thinking about it, to recognize it in ourselves. When we begin to do that, we start to realize this doesn't become as important. Fixing things doesn't become as important when we learn to lean into that challenge, to that narrative. The other thing that I think we do in order to kind of get towards being more authentic is to recognize our ego in things, to recognize that we want to have control of things, to recognize that we base our lives on so many other stories and narratives, that when we can recognize what we're doing at that moment, we begin to, how's the word I'm looking for? We begin to reduce its power over us. We begin to challenge the very notion that we have to be this way or that. Some of you might remember that story that I used to tell about that Tolstoy wrote. The 3 most important questions when the ruler went out looking across the land for the 3 most answers to the 3 most important questions. What should I be doing? With whom should I be doing it? Where should I be doing it? That everywhere he traveled, everyone had different answers, right? Depending on where their narratives were, depending on how they defined power, depending on how they defined success. Until he finally found himself with a guy who was a farmer who was just tilling up soil. And when he got there, he asked the farmer, and the farmer said, you know what, you just need to help me. And so he started helping the farmer, and he was working with the farmer there because the farmer wasn't going to give him any answers. The people in the village had said this farmer was a genius. He had all the answers, but the guy wasn't answering. He was just tilling the soil. So he joined in, and he starts tilling the soil. After a full day of working, he says, you haven't answered my question. And the wise farmer said, what's the question again? And he says, what's the most important thing for me to do? When and with whom? And the farmer said, well, and he just kind of hemmed and hawed, and he started working again. At that very moment, this guy came rushing through the bushes beside the field and came running at him. He had a dagger in his hand, but he was bleeding from the ribs, and he fell at the emperor's feet, at this ruler's feet. And the ruler quickly picked him up, and the ruler started to notice that this guy was going to die. So he quickly asked the farmer to go get some stuff to help mend his wounds. He started mending the wounds. And after a while, he took him inside, and he helped nourish him back to health for the next couple of days. They forgot all about the question. They were dealing with this injury until finally the time had passed. The guy was healed and he was about ready to go. And the guy that he healed told the emperor, the ruler, this story. He said, you don't know why I was here. He said, I was hiding down in the hills below. Your guards saw me when you left them down below to come up here. I was going to kill you because you had attacked my homeland. You killed some of my family members. I came here to kill you. But your guards caught me before I could get away. They stabbed me, and now you healed me. He says, now I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. And the farmer kind of smiled, and the ruler looked over at the farmer, and he says, I think I understand. The most important thing to do is what I'm doing right now. The most important place is where I am right now. The most important people are those with whom I'm with right now. The challenge to be authentic is to live at the kitchen sink level, is to be present in the very moment and try to avoid as much as possible fixing things. What makes, I think, 11:11 so distinctive is this idea of, we're willing to live with the questions. We're willing to live with some of the uncertainty because we realize once we get past our ego, do you know what the opposite of that is? The guy who left the trash, the guy with whom I didn't think I could identify with because he drives a Bentley and sings I can't get no satisfaction. We're all connected. Muslim, Christian, Baha'i, Buddhist, black, white, we're all connected. When we can get past ego, we're no longer trying to fix things. We're just looking at everybody as a gift, and every moment as a gift to move to the next moment.